Today we are looking at Theme 2, Rights and Responsibilities of the AQA GCSE Citizenship course. We are looking particularly at the laws in contemporary society. What is the point of actually having laws? In this session, we will firstly explore the reasons we have laws. Secondly, we'll move on to looking at how to ensure the British legal system upholds fairness and justice. Then we're going to explore the relationships between laws and the people. And finally, we'll finish off with a case study looking at the development of laws to protect homosexual people and same-sex couples. In this part of the session, we will be exploring the reasons why we actually have laws. To start with, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if there were no laws? You can pause the video here and note down some answers.
So what would you do if there were no laws? That was a question that I asked you to think about. So firstly, whenever I teach this to students in class, we have really lengthy discussions about it. And one of the first things kids say is, I would kill, someone. I would kill XXX, okay? Whoever. And this raises a lot of questions. Because immediately what we can see here is that society would be very dangerous if laws didn't exist. In fact, we think that if laws don't exist, that we would have more freedom. But would we have more freedom if people are outside, killing each other left, right and centre? Probably not. We'd probably feel safer at home within enclosed spaces, and we probably wouldn't feel like we want to go outside because it's so dangerous out there. So actually, laws protect, I hope that hasn't come off the board, protect our freedoms. Laws also protect our rights to feel safe, our right to life, which is a fundamental human right. So laws protect our rights too. Another thing that you can look at when it comes to I would kill as a comment is, are we good people just because of the laws that exist around us? So the whole question around morals. Realistically speaking, I'll be honest, even if there weren't any laws, I wouldn't go around killing people, because in my heart, I know that it's a bad thing, it's something that I wouldn't do. Okay, so it brings up the question about morals. Are we good people just because there's laws that tell us how to be good people? Or actually, within our hearts, do we know what is right and wrong, and do we know what is good and what is bad? Other comments that students make are things like, I would steal blah, blah, blah. So usually it's trainers, iPads, whatnot, money, they'd rob a bank or something. Well, what sort of issues do we have regarding stealing? Well, firstly, stealing wouldn't be a crime, okay? So we wouldn't even call it stealing. So it wouldn't even be a crime, and you wouldn't have to steal. Technically, you'll just be taking things. So it's not really even a crime, you're just taking. Also, it brings the question of worth. How much would those trainers be worth? How much would that iPad be worth? Actually, in the long run, it wouldn't be worth anything. In fact, money would have no worth. Because you don't need it. You don't need money to go and buy things. So therefore it wouldn't have any worth. It wouldn't have any value whatsoever. Okay, so worth or value. So the things that would have worth, when you think about this, is actually our basic needs. So things like water and food. Hope that hasn't come off the screen. Water and food will have lots and lots of value. That links us to other types of laws. Okay, so already when we look at stealing and killing, those are criminal laws that are being that we're considering when we think about not having laws in our society. A lot of students, when they say they want water or food, usually say that they'll go to a shop, they'll hoard the water, they'll hide in a room, they'll hoard the food, they'll hold on to it and so on. So the discussion begins about trade laws. And the fact that there'll be demand, huge demand, much higher demand for food and water. Because you know that the value of food and water is very, very high. So trade laws now come into play. Now that's not criminal law. Food and water, there'll be a shortage. Okay, this then leads us to, again, looking at our sort of freedoms and rights. We wouldn't be able to have rights to food and water. We wouldn't be able to have freedom of access to this food and water. Okay, and even in terms of healthcare as well. When we think about healthcare, medical kits and things like that might be worth quite a bit. So again, our freedom to, free healthcare and our rights to this healthcare will be taken away from us. Then get students saying, yeah, do you know what? I'll escape the country. I'll escape. I'll go elsewhere. And when they're asked about this, it's like, yeah, I'd call someone. I'd call them to come and give me a lift. And it's like, well, mobile phone networks wouldn't work, okay? Because again, we've got employment law. Do you really think that someone who works for a mobile phone company is going to be turning up to work every day when there aren't any laws? Okay. We've also got contract laws as well. Contract law. All of our employment comes down to contracts that we have, employment contracts. Those wouldn't exist anymore. So therefore, would people be turning up to work so that, would your contracts be working on your mobile phone? Some students have said, oh, you know what, I'll flee the country. I'll go to the airport and I'll, leave the country. Well, actually, do you think pilots are going to be turning up to work? No, absolutely. They're allowed to breach the contract laws because laws don't exist. So pilots won't be turning up. Mobile companies, well, you wouldn't get Wi-Fi, you wouldn't get internet access and things like that. Mobile companies wouldn't work, you wouldn't be able to call in. Ultimately, laws surround every aspect of our lives. Every single aspect of our lives are dictated by the laws that exist. And it's not just criminal law. And usually when I ask students this question, they always talk about the crimes, killing, stealing, etc., etc. Well, there's so much more. There's contract law, employment law, trade laws, and so much more that would be affected if laws did not exist. And we would not have social order. In fact, it would be complete anarchy, which means there are no laws, there are no governments. In fact, it's our freedoms and rights that are protected by the laws we have in society. And it allows us to have something called social order rather than anarchy. And anarchy is where the government, the laws, they're not in place. Okay, people do what they want and they're not punished for what they do. And they're not held to account for what they do. Now, other students have said to me, Miss, do you know what? I think if there weren't any laws, people would just carry on with life the way it is, because that's what's normal to them. That's just how they would conduct themselves, because that's what they're used to. So that's an interesting argument too. But a lot of people argue that actually it would lead to anarchy and you would lose a lot of your rights and freedoms if laws didn't exist. And while some people think that if laws didn't exist, they'll have more freedom, in fact, it would do the complete opposite. I just want to add that usually at times of war, you might find that anarchy might exist because there aren't those laws in place, there aren't those structures to ensure that people are prosecuted or punished or are being held to account for breaching laws, all the way from criminal law to things like contract laws and employment law and so on. But we must also remember that unjust and unfair laws also exist. And there are people that challenge those unjust and unfair laws to ensure that those laws uphold fairness, justice and equality. So, for example, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, Gandhi, who fought for the independence of India and the better treatment of Indians by the British, Malala, who stood up for women's education and young girls' education in Afghanistan and continues with her work globally, Stonewall, and other organisations that campaign to repeal Section 28 here in the UK, and so forth.
From the discussion we've just had, we can see that the purpose of laws are for justice and fairness. These are two key words that you need to know. Justice is defined as a behaviour or treatment that is morally right or fair. At times there are differences in opinion between countries about what justice is. Each country's justice system is based upon its system of morality, which can be different from another country's system. So, for example, in the USA, in certain states they have the death penalty, whereas in the UK that doesn't exist. So the interpretation and meaning of justice can differ from country to country. The second purpose of law is fairness. So this relates to treating people equally and appropriately according to the circumstances. Ultimately, ask yourself who would suffer most if there aren't laws or if laws are unjust and unfair. You might want to pause the video for a second to really think about that. So who would suffer most if there aren't laws or if laws are unfair and unjust? Would it be the rich or the poor? Would it be the people in positions of authority or the people with no power at all? Would it be women or men? Would it be adults or children? Would it be the majority or the minority? Well, you'd usually find that it would be the poor, it would be those people with no power whatsoever. It would generally be women, generally be children, and it will most certainly be the minority. Here are some case studies. You've got the Nazi Party who persecuted the Jewish community, which led to the Holocaust. This was policies that were introduced by the Nazi parties, laws that were introduced by the Nazi Party, unfair and unjust laws that led to the persecution, the discrimination of the Jewish community, which then eventually led to genocide. You've got the case of Afghani girl Riza Gul, who was brutally attacked by her husband. He chopped off her ears and her nose. She was then flown to another country, but her husband was found by authorities, trialed and imprisoned. You've got a case of Victoria Klimby, who was beaten, tortured and killed by her carers here in the UK. Again, her carers were prosecuted and they were imprisoned. Similarly, with the Nazi Party, the Nuremberg trials were put in place and leading officials from the Nazi Party were trialled and justice was served. Now, if we lived in a society where unfair and unjust laws existed, where there wasn't a court system, where there weren't a system in place to ensure that perpetrators of such heinous crimes were punished, we'd be living in a very dangerous, unfair and unjust world. And that's why we need laws. That is the end of this part of the session. And next we'll be moving on to looking at the British legal system and how it upholds fairness and justice.